Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. A few weeks ago, I used an AI image generator to create this image. As you can see, the prompt I used was historian tries myth-busting, and the results were frankly more disturbing than I'd expected. I mean, just check out those fingers. They are probably the strangest fingers I have seen an AI image generator create. I wasn't going for disturbing. My plan was to create an image that I could use for a community tab post. I put this up on my community tab. I was asking you to detail and list any historical myths that you thought or wanted me to try and bust. That is the plan for today. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who took the time to respond to that post, and I have got a number of myths to try and bust today, and I'm going to cover all of the ones that I have received so far. There were, however, also a few requests that I think would be more suited to being video topics. They have been added to my list for the future, so you can look out for videos on Catherine de Medici, the development of maps, the history of feminism, and also the royals who gave their patronage to various scientists and inventors, and in turn, the effect that that patronage had on their realm. I've also had a question about the music that I use in my intro and outro. It's called Greenery, and it's by Silent Partner, and there's a link to it in my description box. Right. I think that's everything that's covered off. I am going to be clicking through these fairly quickly because there were quite a few myths to cover. In some cases, I have made videos on these things or connected to these things that I will leave linked. But if at any point you would like more information, more detail, then please do use the comments section to let me know that you'd like a full video on anything that we're going to be touching on now. Anyway, let's hop in to busting those myths. Myth number one is that in the past, all women, or perhaps more properly, all people, got married very young. This is, I think, a fairly perennial one, and there has been work done on this. There have been articles and indeed monographs written either wholly or in part focusing on this myth, this topic. I'm going to direct you towards H.E. Hallam's article from 1985, which is entitled Age at First Marriage and Age at Death in the Lincolnshire Fenland, 1252 to 1478. In this article, there is a discussion of the various ages, a whole range of ages where first marriage can be seen to take place. What is interesting is how wide that bracket is, because there's a question about when these average first marriages are in fact taking place, and this article explains why. There are, for example, sparse records. We know that most of our historical records favour the elites, the royalty, the monarchy of given places and their nobility. Even there, we don't always have accurate dates of birth for people. If we haven't got accurate dates of birth, we simply don't know, in many cases, how old they are when they are first marrying. When we get away from these elites, we then see an even greater lack of birth record. So therefore, it's even harder for us to determine the age at marriage in many cases for people who are not noble. Another factor that's going to push up the age at which first marriage is going to happen across society, particularly when we consider those who are the majority of society, namely those who are not royal or noble, is the fact that if you are marrying, so you're not going to enter the church, the man in question has to be able to support his own wife, his own household, and his own children. If you are not royal, not noble, and not entering the church, then that perhaps means you're going to have an apprenticeship. And I have got a video on apprenticeship that I will leave linked. Most apprenticeships do seem to span a period of around about 7 years. In many cases, but not always, starting when a boy is perhaps around 14. Following that apprenticeship, you're not going straight into a world of work, making a sufficient amount of money. There needs to be a further period of working as a journeyman. Then you become a master. And perhaps a master is in a position to have his own apprentices. And if you can have your own apprentices, you're in probably a pretty good position to have a household with a wife and children. To get to this point, you are looking at being in your mid-20s, I think, by the earliest. Why we think people marry young is perhaps because we do have quite startling cases that are fairly famous. Margaret Beaufort springs to mind. She marries very young, but also that marriage is uncommonly consummated younger than would be expected, with the result being that she had an incredibly difficult pregnancy and labour. It was thought that both she and her son Henry, who goes on to become Henry VII, were likely to die because of the difficulties of the birth. Margaret Beaufort would not have more children. There is another myth, connected, arguably bound up in this. While people are more willing to accept that men are marrying later for these financial reasons, there will be those that say yes, but the women they're marrying would have been younger, that they would have been marrying much younger women, even girls, because of the age at which women are still fertile. As if, in the past, women would reach 25 and suddenly not be able to produce children, not to bring them to term. Now, I don't claim to be a biologist or a maternal medicine specialist, but I can think of no reason why there would be a drastic expansion in the age at which women can continue to have babies in these last few hundred years. There are, of course, factors that play into this. In addition to having quite a small subject pool, as we've mentioned already, with fairly limited numbers in terms of dating, so both mothers and the babies they're having, where the records do seem to point to an idea of women having children younger, of not being able to produce and carry to term when they get past a certain age, what we have to factor in there, I think, is the increased risk of either maternal mortality, so women dying in childbirth, or of injury caused by pregnancy and childbirth that then prevents future pregnancies from taking place. All in all, women could well have pregnancies at the same rate and to the same ages that we are seeing now. Also, there is little evidence to suggest that the majority of women are marrying much before their early to mid-20s. So that is one myth that we need to have busted. Myth number 2 is that Jane Parker, later Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was the great villain in the Tudor story. That she was responsible for being deceptive, for sharing evidence against her husband and her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn, that brought them down and ultimately led to their execution. That she is in fact the architect in some ways of the fall of Anne Boleyn. That in turn, she then becomes the architect of the fall of Catherine Howard in some way. That she had some hatred for the Howard family that she was enacting. Some suggest this is because she did not like her husband George, that he was cruel to her, and so she wanted revenge. That she was jealous of her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn's success, that she was disliked by the family, and this made her bitter. I have made a video on Jane Boleyn that I will leave linked, but in short, my understanding of her doesn't support this narrative. I see Jane Boleyn as somebody who was well within the Boleyn-Howard faction. I see Jane Boleyn as somebody who fully supported this faction and was a trusted member within it. When George Boleyn was trying to defend himself, it was said that he complained, "On the word of one woman, you would believe such a great evil of me." And those who believe that Jane Boleyn is the architect of destruction have assumed and asserted that she is the woman in question. I'm not quite sure why. If he meant Jane, would he not say, "On the word of my wife, you would believe such a great evil of me"? There are those who suggest that because Jane goes on to serve the future wives of Henry VIII, that she must have made a deal with the devil, so to speak, and that deal was about saving her own profit, her own skin, and bringing down those around her. I think that's a remarkable gamble. I think that this is somebody who has been incredibly loyal to the Boleyn family, who has tied her own fortunes to it. Supporting the family, trying to get her sister-in-law out of trouble, trying to remain married to the brother-in-law of the King of England, is surely far more profitable and far more beneficial to her than being the wife of an executed traitor. But that's just me. Check out my video and see if you agree with my point of view. Myth number 3. That Juana of Castile was completely mad. I have made a video on Juana of Castile and the allegations of her supposed madness that I will leave linked. In that video, I explore the available evidence to see whether or not the claims that she was so completely insane that she had to be effectively locked away, that the governance of her realms had to be taken over by her father, her husband, her son, because she simply couldn't be trusted, and I'm not sure what that evidence actually says. There is compelling evidence that states that she was in fact completely insane. However, who is putting that evidence together? The men who are trying to rule on her behalf. This is one of the ones where I'm not quite sure whether it's a myth or not. I think it's certainly possible that Juana of Castile did have some mental imbalance that was innate to her, that potentially made her dangerous. But to me, it's equally likely that she was surrounded by men who were power hungry, who wanted to hold on and take more power, and that she was in effect unable to defend herself against them. And in the end, perhaps their treatment of her did in fact make her mad. Myth number 4 is that Anne of Cleves was ugly. This question, this myth if you will, is another one that I have made a video on that I will be leaving linked. And of course, as the old adage goes, beauty is very much in the eye of the beholder. And for that reason, I suppose it's difficult to assert whether or not this is in fact a myth. For me, the answer to that question is, do you think this image depicts an unattractive or ugly woman? The portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger, commissioned on the orders of Henry VIII to show him what his intended bride Anne of Cleves actually looked like. In my opinion, this portrait depicts a woman who is, at the very least, conventionally attractive, and certainly not hideously ugly. And this matters because I believe this portrait was accurate. And you may want to challenge me, because of course a portrait can be painted to be flattering, and they often were. Just look at the portraits that were made of Henry VIII, and indeed of his daughter Elizabeth. But in this case, this portrait was commissioned by Henry VIII to show him what his intended bride looked like. And the person set to do that task was somebody employed by Henry, who worked at his court. Is it really feasible that Hans Holbein the Younger would risk his living, even his life, to deceive his king into a marriage with Anne of Cleves when she didn't look like this? I don't think so. I think this portrait is what Anne of Cleves looked like, and if that is the case, then it's clearly a myth that she was ugly. Myth number 5 is that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. First and foremost, in my opinion, it's a fairly bold claim to assert that you have discovered a land where other people are already inhabiting it, and those inhabitants are individuals that you end up meeting. But if we cast aside that, shall we say, small point, the place that Columbus sights, the area he lands upon, is not modern-day North America. Instead, he is credited with being the first European to sight the Bahamas archipelago, and then the island that we later would know as Hispaniola, at least for a time. Today, that land is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Columbus would make later voyages. On those voyages, he would reach further south. He went to Central and South America. But never at any point did he reach the place that we now call the United States. Our next myth, myth 6, connects heavily to myth 5. The myth is as follows: that all people thought the earth was flat before Columbus made his 1492 voyage. On this point, I'm going to defer to Geoffrey Barton Russell, to his 1991 book entitled Inventing the Flat Earth, Columbus and Modern Historians. In that book, he explains that, quote, "No educated person in the history of Western civilization, from the 3rd century BC onward, believed that the earth was flat." Russell also helpfully offers us the origin of where this particular myth or misunderstanding came about, namely, that in 1828, when one Washington Irving published The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, he chose to spice up his tale by asserting that Columbus's journey had especially amazed his contemporaries because he used it to prove the world wasn't flat. Myth 7, and forewarning, I am about to drop the F-bomb. Myth 7 is that the word fuck originated out of the acronym fornication under consent of the king. Possibly the thing I find the most interesting about this particular myth is that it surely insinuates that at some point in our collective history there must have been at least one monarch who was so concerned with his subjects', shall we say, bedroom habits, that he required them to seek a permission slip, a certificate, if you will, from him in order for them to copulate. Quite how this would have been managed, large scale across a nation, is a question I have. Why any monarch would particularly care is another. I have certainly not heard of this happening in our historical past. However, if you have got any evidence of any king or monarch asking for this sort of thing from their subjects, please do let me know, because that is truly fascinating. Instead, I'm going to hop us over to the OED and spoil the fun a little bit. Instead, it appears that this four-letter expletive is one that we inherited from a Germanic language, and it can be found in written English by the early 1500s, which is, I think, fairly late, at least in my mind. However, this can perhaps be accounted for as it was likely in spoken or colloquial English from a far earlier date. Myth number 8 is that Elizabeth I was secretly a man. This, I think, stems out of the so-called Bisley Boy story. In this story, little Elizabeth is visiting the town of Bisley. While there, she falls ill and sadly dies. The attendants watching over her panic, terrified about what her father might do, and so they grab a very handy local red-headed boy who looks enough like Elizabeth apparently that he can be popped in her dress and passed off as Elizabeth to a father that scarcely sees her. This boy then presumably goes through the usual puberty, no comments are mentioned, and then is allowed to rule as Queen Elizabeth I. It's a great story, and one that's often repeated. And I think in large part it's so attractive to a number of people, particularly people in the Victorian and Edwardian period, because it explains why Elizabeth, an unmarried woman, could be so successful. However, for me, it is obviously a myth, because if she were truly the Bisley boy rather than Elizabeth, daughter of Henry and Anne, then she would not have had any periods. And this is a woman who, throughout her life, is one of the most heavily surveilled women on earth, certainly in England. The people who were seeking her hand as queen for marriage would have wanted to know that she could produce an heir. If Elizabeth missed a single period, that would have been on the international gossip market the next day. The notion that she could have gone through life never menstruating, or that she could have covered it up in some way and nobody would have spoken about it, is to me completely unfeasible. Our next myth is that Anne Boleyn had obvious, visible physical differences, that she had that sick finger, a wen under her chin, and a protruding front tooth. For the origin of this particular description, or myth, we should perhaps look no further than the writing of one Nicholas Sander. He was a devout Roman Catholic working during the reign of Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. I think it's worth pointing out that there's no evidence that he was at court during Anne's reign, that he was old enough to reliably remember what she looked like, or indeed that he ever saw her in person. However, his faith difference from her daughter put him at odds with her. He was looking for ways to discredit Elizabeth, to damage and destabilise her rule, and one of the ways he chose was to attack her mother. Nicholas Sander was writing at a time when an individual's outward physical appearance was viewed as being a sign not only of their inner humoral makeup, their health if you will, but also of their moral character. And so, by presenting Anne in this way, as in quotes, deformed, he is insinuating that the outer matches the inner, that you can judge this book by its cover, that just as she is physically different, she is also internally, morally different, that she is, in fact, that witch that managed to bewitch Henry VIII into marriage, and through this bewitching, that marriage was rendered null and void. And, in the case of Elizabeth, if her mother truly did bewitch her father, then does that mean she was a product of a demonically inspired union? A hard thing to be, I would say, if you're also looking to be the supreme governor of the Church of England. Our next myth is that corsets were massively uncomfortable, that they stopped women from being able to move and or to breathe. First and foremost, I think we need to talk about what we mean by corset. This description sounds to me like a tight-laced corset, something that was only possible to achieve once metal eyelets had been invented. And even then, women who are tight-lacing themselves to the point that they are altering their rib cage, damaging internal organs, are a very, very small percentage of the population, right at the very top, who don't have to work for a living, shall we say. But these women's lives are made possible by the labours of other women, women who are making their clothes, helping them get dressed, fixing their hair, cleaning their house, providing their food. And these women are also wearing corsetry. Women who have to run up and down stairs, carrying coal scuttles, who have to bend down to pick up and clean. They cannot be in these tight-laced corsets. It has to be something that is more movable and breathable. And corsetry has been around for a very long time. When we're talking about the Elizabethan period, for example, we probably wouldn't use the word corset. Instead, we'd use stays or a pair of bodies. These are boned, laced items. You can't really create that deforming, tight-lacing shape because, as I said, no metal eyelets here yet. Throughout time, rather than being a source of discomfort, all corsetry has, I think, rather been a way to make you more comfortable. When you think about the weight of undergarments and overgarments, the padding, the cages for skirts, the heavy velvets and silks and furs, having that boned corsetry to help support that weight, to help spread it across your body, is a way of protecting the skin underneath. If you didn't wear a corset, but you tried to wear, I don't know, a farthingale and a bum roll and a velvet overgown, before very long, that would start to cut into your skin. It would leave you with bruising, marks, even scars. Corsetry prevents that. And I know this firsthand because on occasion I have forgotten to put on a pair of stays or a pair of bodies, and I've put the overgown on. And within a very short space of time, half an hour or so, I have swiftly realised that I need to get undressed and redressed again with the appropriate undergarments underneath if I want to spend the day in anything close to comfort. Myth 11. That Elizabeth Bathory murdered her serving girls to bathe in their blood. I have made a video on Elizabeth Bathory that I will be leaving linked. In that video, I look at the allegations against her and see what available evidence there is to back it up. And in doing so, I can't prove the case either way. It's possible she was guilty. However, on the balance of probability, I think most likely she wasn't. In fact, I see the allegations of murder levelled against her in a very similar way to the allegations of madness that were levelled against Juana of Castile. In short, I think that Elizabeth Bathory was probably in somebody's way. Somebody wanted her to get out of the way, and they used these allegations to do that. With that being said, I do argue that it is just possible that there is some fire behind this smoke, that perhaps Elizabeth Bathory used her education and intellect to help, as she may have seen it, the women of her local community. Is it possible that Elizabeth Bathory, rather than being a murderess bathing in young girls' blood, was in fact some kind of abortionist? For me, that is perhaps the only way there could be any truth to these rumours, to this myth. The next myth is one that I see being regurgitated very frequently on all kinds of social media, and that is that nobody washed, or if they did, it was only ever once a year. I'm not completely sure what the origins of this particular myth are. I do remember being a child and hearing that Queen Elizabeth I was supposed to have said that she only bathed once a year, and that even then she didn't need to. And so perhaps from that, other people heard a similar story, and they have extrapolated that this was true for her, and if true for the Queen, then true for everybody else. But that, I think, overlooks the existence of this, frankly, ubiquitous item. It is the ewer and basin. This would have been a feature of almost every home before plumbed-in bathrooms existed. People would wash on a daily basis. They would wash their hands, their face, perhaps their feet. They would wash the parts of their body that were prone to sweating and smelling. And they would do this using a basin and ewer, like the one shown here, or perhaps they would go to a local water source, to a stream or a river. In a time before germ theory, when it was believed that infection, disease, sickness was spread through something called miasma, which literally translates to bad air. Bad smells were deemed to be dangerous, a source of potentially fatal infection. With this in mind, is it likely that if you believe that bad smells from your own body could potentially make yourself and or your loved one sick, that you wouldn't attempt as best you could to combat that? This does not mean that our historical counterparts approach bathing in exactly the same way that we do today, with showers or full body immersion on a daily basis, with commercially bought soaps, shampoos, shower gels, perfumes or deodorants. This perhaps was more sparingly used. There was instead a reliance on linen, for example, both as undergarments that could be changed regularly, at least daily, and if you were wealthy, perhaps more frequently than that, especially if somebody else was doing your laundry. Linen is fabulous because when worn as an undershirt, it produces a barrier that absorbs sweat, but also protects a person's outer garments from contact with their body. And this is very useful because frequently outer garments either were not or could not be washed frequently in most circumstances. Linen was also used to rub oils from the hair, to keep it looking fresh and clean and to absorb anything that might potentially smell. For ladies who famously wore their hair very long, it would be braided up and bound underneath a coif made of linen, plus their hat or hood. This protects the hair from coming into contact with dirt and grease, so the hair stays cleaner and fresher for longer. So while people may not have been jumping under the shower or hopping in the bath every day, they certainly were concerned about how they smelt and how clean their bodies were. Next up, we have the myth that all of the torture devices that we see today were actually used. Perhaps, like me, you will have a memory of being in a museum or perhaps a heritage site, of rounding a corner and finding yourself confronted by a frankly horrendous display of torture implements, usually accompanied by some pretty graphic and grotesque stories. Perhaps you've seen iron maidens, pairs of anguish, thumb screws, breast rippers, all sorts of deeply, deeply unpleasant things that have also made their way into popular culture. Perhaps you've been watching some historical fiction and you have been confronted with a dungeon scene where somebody is hanging from the walls by their thumbnails or some such. When I've looked into the history of torture in England, one of the first things you are confronted with is the fact that torture has never been legal. It's always been something that has required some kind of royal dispensation or licence. Later, it became illegal. Nevertheless, whether not fully legal or actively illegal, that doesn't mean that torture didn't, and won't take place. However, some of the devices that we are shown are frankly outlandish. Take, for example, the Iron Maiden. There is little evidence for an object like this ever existing before the 19th century. Indeed, when you explore the times where torture is known to have taken place, the methods used are actually fairly sparse. There doesn't seem to have been this menu of devices on display. I've seen accounts of people being racked. I've seen accounts of people being placed in manacles and suspended by their wrists. I've seen accounts of people being placed in the Scavenger's or Skeffington's Daughter, which contracts your body down. And I've also heard accounts of people being placed in the cell of Little Ease, a space so small that you could not get comfortable sitting, lying or standing. So from that, the torture is either going to be stretching you or shrinking you. Above and beyond this, we have known for a very, very long time that you can get somebody to talk without touching or harming a hair on their head. All you've got to do is stop them from sleeping. As for the other devices that we see on display at museums and heritage sites, for those ones that are not 19th century inventions designed to make the medieval past seem much more ooky spooky, if these items were in fact from the period, either medieval or early modern, then I think that in most cases they performed one of two functions. Either they were there to show off, so to speak. They were presented to a person that you wanted to talk as a threat of what might happen. Alternatively, they were things that were found objects. Perhaps you find yourself a loyal subject of Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant English privateer on a mission that entails raiding Spanish ships. Would it not be useful if perhaps you should bring back some fairly horrific-looking torture devices? items that might show just how wicked and evil Roman Catholic Spain could be. Is it possible that some of these devastating torture implements were nothing more than a propaganda device, intended to make an enemy nation, an enemy faith, look bad? And last but by no means least, we have the myth that King John signed the Magna Carta. I will keep this very short. There was no need for King John to pick up his quill and sign the Magna Carta, because he set his seal to it instead. And thus, King John didn't sign the Magna Carta, he sealed it. So what do you think of the myths that I've tried to bust in today's video? Were there any that you would like me to go into more depth about? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, and the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, and that will help to grow our community. I'm a bit stumped as to which emoji to pick, so I think perhaps the myth that stood out to you the most, perhaps the one that surprised you the most when I busted it, if you could pick an emoji related to that, and I'll see if I can guess which one you're talking about. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please do share it with your friends. If you like my channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel. And if you think you are subscribed, have a check now just to make sure you've not been mysteriously unsubscribed by YouTube against your will. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear. And that way, YouTube claims they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I'm next going live, which I do to talk about the history news. So I know you are not going to want to miss that. We have, of course, got our failsafe now. If you head to my website, which will be linked, www.katrinamarchant.com. If you go to the contact page, you will see there's a little box. Put your email address in that box. That will add you to my mailing list, and I will send you an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to, but also to send you any useful links that you might want for my content over the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.